We're going to go now across to Teri Kruger. She's the founding director of Synergetics Sustainable Solutions, and I think she's going to be talking about a topic that's quite interesting. As we move towards EVs, how can this move and this change also help us reduce road deaths on our roads? Which we know in South Africa, road deaths are a massive cause for concern and something that we need to address. Teri, are you with us this morning?
Absolutely. Good morning to you all. Thank you so much for allowing me in today with something that's probably a controversial subject.
We love controversy, Teri.
Thank you so much. It's been fantastic to hear all the previous speakers. Do you want me to start now?
You can go for it, love. We are ready and waiting, and you can climb into it. Go for it.
Excellent. So, yes, I've been very, very curious about electric mobility and electric vehicles for some time now. I'm obviously very excited to be one of those that will one day have one of them and drive cleaner air for the future. I have been mostly involved more in the development of the renewable energy sector in terms of the IPP, but also the commercial sector. And very much my passion has been over past 2 decades approximately working alongside an organization that looks at injury prevention in children. And it's actually quite astounding what happens to our children in a country that's quite developed like South Africa with our very strong road networks, and yet our children are not actually looked after very well. So basically what it comes down to is that we are creating cities and street environments that are simply just not safe for our children. There are many aspects to this, and we will be exploring different aspects of it now. So just a bit of background. As I said, I've been working alongside childsafe.org.za, which is based at the Red Cross Children's Hospital. We've been looking at all types of injury prevention, from burns to drownings to poisoning to fires, all sorts of gunshots, etc. And I was very privileged in 2014 to lead a team of people that actually produced a small solar system that is sitting on the roof at the Red Cross Children's Hospital and giving ChildSafe free electricity. And this has been going since 2017. So it's a good connection and a good link. So I'm very passionate about that. But how do I know all of this information about our children? In 2018, I was contracted as the workshop director to look at the PRIXA project, which is prevention of road injuries impacting on children in South Africa. And we did an extensive study with UCT in terms of what is the available information, what has been said in terms of papers, what is the law, how does the law treat them, what are the regulations, and all of these aspects, as well as looking at international best practices. And what we found is that globally there's a staggering amount of 1.25 million deaths every year with our children. And at least 500 children are killed every single day. Now, these are globals, but South Africa has at least double of the world's fatality rate, which is quite staggering if you think that we don't really have as many vehicles. And what it's actually showing us is that there's a definite need for us to address this because it's a public health issue, and it's time that we address this. They are our future. So you'll see the map, how very, very dark red Africa is and other areas where we have very high incidence of injuries that kill our children. And then on the right, you'll see what we call the 3 E's. Now, the 3 E's with the methodology we adopted for the prevention of road injury accidents in children in South Africa and the PRIXA program. And what we did was we ran a series of workshops all over the country. I went to all 9 provinces, and we ran workshops with people from health, from enforcement, from education, social development, all the different agencies like your RTMC, legal partners. And we did an extensive understanding of what are the issues that are impacting our children. So are there evidence? So we looked at what is in the law and what is being enforced at the moment. We looked at the education and the engineering aspects. So basically what it will come down to is that there will be an increase in incidence in low-income countries. It's just several factors alluding to this. One being is that we have a lot of new generational drivers, one that have not actually had vehicles in their families previously. So there's a little bit of a reference. We don't have the best quality of roads. I can attest to that. I did travel to all 9 provinces and drove most of the time. And high-income countries, they're expecting to have a decrease in this. So motor vehicle crashes are the number one killer of our children on the roads. And if you can see in the illustration how our children are treated in traffic, very often it's about accessing education, it's about getting children to school, and unfortunately, the vehicles themselves may not be in good quality, but also there are little to no seatbelts used whatsoever. So if you look at least 7.5 million of our learners and students are actually looking to go to school by walking most of the days. And if you look at the Eastern Cape area, where the N2 kind of divides quite a few of the cities, where these children have to walk alongside this major highway with no pavements, no footpaths, and they have a terrible time, sometimes walking up to 45 minutes a day just to access education. And here you can see a bit more of an urban context where there are no pedestrian crossings. Often the children are taking taxis, and then the taxi drops them off on the left-hand side of the road, and they still have to cross the road as well to get to school. Yes, in 2017, very, very sadly, we had 1,300 children just killed in our roads. And this number is not abating at any point. This is why I say it is a public health emergency. You can see the conditions at which our children's need to access to the other side of the road sometimes, where the schools are placed on the one side of the road and then they actually live on the village on the other side of the road. And even though they do try and put infrastructure into place in terms of overhead bridges and things, they very often find it's a very long way around, and human nature is what it is. It wants the shortest route. So if we make a comparison with Netherlands, for instance, they were part of this whole PRIXA program as well, assisting us with best practice internationally. Well, it's 10 to 20 times safer to live as a child in the Netherlands than it is in South Africa. So the premise was, how can we learn from what they were doing and international best practices, and what can we recommend coming out of this whole program? Excuse me. So you'll see that 75% of children are impacted in traffic or anyway in the vehicle at any given time. So this is why we have such a high incidence. There's also often that children aren't put into seat belts or to safety seats in the vehicles, which I'm hoping that when we do look at EVs, I know with the more sophisticated vehicles, if I can express it that way, that they are now internalizing their child seats, or at least having fixed clippings there for a person to put a child seat in very successfully. So that is one way of going. But for the most part, it's a lot of human nature that say we want to take the shortest route, we want to get to school quickly, we're running late, so we'll run across the train tracks, etc. And that's what's actually exasperating the whole situation. And the truth is that our children young children simply don't have the ability to assess when this truck is coming at high speed from the one angle. They need to get across the road. They can see their friends on the other side. They don't have the cognitive ability at the very young age to be able to assess that that car is traveling too fast. And if I run across the road now, that's what's going to happen. It's also exceedingly obvious that drivers actually wouldn't stop even at pedestrian crossings where they're obliged to stop to allow the children to come over. And exceeding the speed limits and lack of enforcement is very much a thing of drivers here in South Africa. Poor visibility. We have areas, especially in informal areas, where the children don't even have street lighting. So security and visibility becomes an option. And also on like major highways and byways like the N2, where there is no street lighting and these trucks and these vehicles are traveling at extremely high speeds and these children are having to walk on the side of the roads. And then there's insufficient integration of road and land use and public transport planning. This is one of the outcomes that we realized, that 60% of solving the problem is actually with the re-engineering of the situation. And this is where a bit of lateral thinking and a bit of enthusiasm about the electric vehicle industry and where we're going with this is to use this opportunity to look at how we engineer, say, our public transport services that are now going to adopt electric vehicles. I'm hoping to hear more from Golden Arrow tomorrow with Gideon Neertling, to actually look at the human factors. How can we engineer the way that the probability of a child actually encountering vehicle traffic or actually running into the road, as you can see the young man in the bottom picture, that there's a perfectly good bridge that goes across the whole highway, and yet for several reasons they decide it's quicker and safer, or quicker to run across the main highway of about 4 lanes. This is just near where the airport is in Cape Town. But there's also the unintended consequences whereby these bridges are put up there, they're caged in so nobody can jump off, but the criminal element then actually uses the 2 entrances. They wait for someone to be on the entrances and then they block the entrances. So it becomes a security and safety issue as well. So we really need to think quite clearly and a little bit more laterally of how we're going to solve these problems and possibly try and engineer our roads that they are not separating, say, schools from where the children live, for instance. So the kind of proposal that the whole PRIXA project came up with was to look at a human-centric versus a vehicle-centric design. Essentially, again, separating the children and separating pedestrians and cyclists away from the rest of the traffic. And public transport is then prioritized over the humans. And then third place, or fourth place, should I say, the individual household vehicles, which I know would not be a very popular thought, that we all need to get to where we need to go. But if we consider that our children are our future, and if we give them a good opportunity to get through to their education, to make university, who knows how many other very special, like Tutus and Madibas we have amongst us. So we really need to give this good consideration. You can see on the top, that is a class 5 residential street in terms of how we propose, or how it is proposed from an engineering point of view, to separate the cars, the people, the pedestrians and the cyclists. And further down, there's even a further distinction where the cycle tracks have their own particular cycling areas. So essentially, it's about separating children away from the traffic. This is an example in the Netherlands where they have very, very clearly marked areas of pedestrian crossings. They often have some kind of gates or fences that actually don't allow a child to run straight into a pedestrian crossing either, so they keep some kind of barrier, and also a way to calm the traffic down. It's been proposed that in South Africa, for instance, we look at doing a 30 kilometer per hour speed limit, especially around schools and where there are a lot of children. Tshwane municipality have over the years been testing this out, and they found a massive decrease in terms of children that get harmed. So to actually appreciate these kind of nuances that need to happen, and as we change towards our public transport systems, to actually look at ways that we have safe places where our children can get off and maybe go straight into the school vicinity, as opposed to being put off on the side of the road and having to cross major traffic where everybody's in a hurry, and they very seldom actually look at the stop streets as well. So while we're thinking about this possibility of changing the way we treat our children in traffic, we need to look for very clear sight lines. Often children kind of come in between vehicles and they're trying to look between the vehicles to see if they're able to cross the street. And unfortunately, the driver very often doesn't actually even notice the child is there until the child is in front of them catching their ball. I'm hoping that with EVs, in the way that we have proximity alerts and proximity sensors, that this would be an additional tool in this whole area of saving the future of our children. Adequate lighting. If you look at the illustration in the middle, there's a nice big park area where there are trees for children and there's gardens for them to play in. And during the day, it's well lit, but in the evenings or in the late afternoons, especially where we have a lot of rain and thunderstorms, we need to also do adequate lighting there. And we must minimize the concealed and isolated routes. There was a story of one of the provinces that I visited, that the children having to walk to school from the one village through towards the town to the schools and the colleges, that there is a whole avenue of unsavory characters that actually try and get our children involved in drugs and all sorts of illegal activities as well. So to try and keep the routes more visible, more open, and avoid the entrapment, as we were saying, with the walk over bridge as well. So we need to look at what the citizens need. Our children need play parks. They need areas that they can run and release all that energy. They can learn to climb. They can build their muscle strength. So those kind of park areas, and you mix the park areas to maybe be next to where the bus stop is, for instance, that the children can play while they're waiting. I recently caught the My City bus. I often do that. I really, really like the My City service here in Cape Town. And I noticed that at the one school stop we made, there must have been about at least 50 to 70 children hanging out on the side of the pavement, playing games as they do while the cars are buzzing past at quite a rate. So just put some thought into those areas where you now have your terminals for the people to alight. And if we create a sense of ownership by getting the communities involved in the actual building and maintenance and looking after the management of these facilities as well, that will hopefully also encourage good use of all of the equipment. There's seldom signs or any information, particularly to drivers, to say, there's a school alert, there's children crossing up front. We need to look at this more carefully. Recently, I listened to a webinar about the whole road sign organization that speaks about the cost of producing signs and putting up signs. And as soon as you've got a sign, there's someone who wants to go and deface the sign and put a different sticker on it or kind of claim it for their own. So I understand that there are technical issues, but let's be smart, let's engineer them, and let's put them in a way that are above reproach, if I can put it that way. And I said early on about there are certain neighborhoods where they now plan a road where they've actually completely cut right through the neighborhood, that the schools are on the one side of this major highway and on the other side, that's where the schools are. So we need to think more clearly of that, or to have more direct access. So in all of this, we can do a good green building design for the built environment, try and reduce our carbon emissions in terms of not only the vehicular traffic, but in terms of the cement and the structures that we use. So that was my plea to you all, to say, let's actually be quite innovative in our thinking. Let's take on the challenge of actually looking at different ways to treat our children, and to rather put that money into better infrastructure and particularly for some very reliable electricity as well. Thank you for your time.
Fantastic, Teri. I mean, look, I think it's a great topic. We all know pedestrian deaths in South Africa particularly are a massive concern for our country. I want to try and tie it back. Obviously, our focus is a little bit on EVs, and I'm getting a couple of questions, people asking, please link this with the change to EVs. So from your perspective, wrap that in a bow for us, and why you think that there's an opportunity with EVs coming in that you can now reduce these road deaths. Where do you think is it a change in people's behaviour, or is it just because the cars come with proximity centres? What is the big focus for you in tying this to the change towards e-mobility?
Well, thank you for that. Essentially, it's been mooted that the main push for EV vehicles will be electric buses or public transport buses, or very certainly in the circles that I'm moving around in. For instance, childsafe.org.za have a program called Safe Transport to School, where they literally have a training center for bus drivers and minibus drivers to get trained in advanced driving skills. They get medical reports in terms of their health. They get trained in first aid and all sorts of areas in a bid to actually assist our children getting to and from school safely. So public transport is a way that can happen. There will be needs for areas that they need to put in new infrastructure in terms of where the stations are, where the people get on and off from the different vehicles. So looking at those areas and actually taking into consideration that there are often a lot of children that are traveling on the public transport. As we said, 7.5 million access it every day, and unfortunately a lot of them have to walk. But if we could get the infrastructure right and possibly use solar power to give these children, anybody in a school uniform, a free ride to school, I think we'd be quite advanced in terms of our thinking.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. I think that gives good clarity as to kind of your talk around e-mobility.
That was fascinating, and thank you, Teri, for the presentation. I just wonder, and maybe you can kind of comment on my perception of this. I just wonder if physical infrastructure changes are much more expensive and harder to do than investment in things like the Internet of Things and EV software. Where traffic lights talk to cars and as you call it, proximity sensors, which these cars obviously are very sophisticated. But besides the cars being an isolated silo, I rather take the money that we might have invested in infrastructure, physical things, which are much more expensive in my mind, and invested in technology that actually helps the cars make decisions, because that's one big part that is missing, I think, in the future of South Africa, is the Internet of Things and objects or things talking to each other. I take my EV as an example. I now drive slower in parking lots because it's so quiet. You can't hear the EV coming. So there are downsides.
Absolutely, all very valid points. And, to me, it's always about a symphony. It's not one or the other. So, yes, we can look at the infrastructure and there is a cost attached to it. But what is it costing us in our duty to care? And actually, for instance, I know I've been very involved in terms of burns and poisoning, particularly from the paraffin kind of energy poverty side, where just one single operation for a burn survivor would be over 100,000 rands in investment. And that's one single. And that's not to say the loss of the child's limb or the family loss or job losses or the future that child could have had. So we need to think very carefully about how we speak about this cost benefit. But my approach is more proactive, to say where we are going to make those investments, let's consider the children. Let's actually think of the engineering, not for the anthropometric, that word, in terms of, that's the person who's sitting in the car and that's how the car must be designed, which is obviously excellent. And that's why I say the interior can also happen in terms of car seats, etc., and proper seat belts that can adjust to as the child grows older. But also looking at the revival of the automotive industry to come up with creative ideas of how we actually avoid crashing into children. I know one of the unintended consequences of a lot of these big buckies that we have that have the bull bars was that they were so high that they had several incidents where a person reversing in their own driveway drove over their own children. So it's a case of how do we, one, make the child more visible, and that means maybe more reflective clothing, putting them into an environment where it's very well lit, and that there's obvious corridors where the children should walk, whereas sometimes the criminal element take over those areas and then force them into dark and dangerous places. So the proximity alerts, the relook at the interior design, and then also how we do our infrastructure going forward.
Fantastic. Teri, and I think, you touched on a lot of topics there, and, I think it's important. Obviously, a lot of people, are focusing on their EVs, but we have to focus around pedestrians, as you say, the children. One of the questions I've had come through is, would you consider that the sound, or lack thereof, as George has now referred to when he's driving in a parking lot, actually make drivers more aware of the issue? At the end of the day, drivers of EVs have to take responsibilities that these EVs are quiet, or is that, how do you see that balancing it off?
Sorry, I'd missed part of that question. I had a little glitch here.
No problem. So with the EVs being so quiet, do you see the fact that drivers need to start taking more responsibility for driving a quiet vehicle? As George has mentioned, he drives slowly in a parking lot because it's a quiet vehicle. Do you think that that's something that's going to come through, where drivers are aware that they're now driving a vehicle that's a lot more quiet, especially with children, having to be thought of?
I think that's a very loaded question, because while we know that there are a lot of street signs saying that we shouldn't go more than 120, that does not really necessarily mean we do that. But it is a good thought that because we are quieter as vehicles, that we need to be a lot more cognizant about what is happening around us, so that we don't engage in a way that can harm anybody else. But yes, definitely an area that needs to be considered.
Fantastic. So, Teri, as we go forward, do you see vehicles? George had mentioned his vehicle as a pedestrian sensor. These EVs come through. Do you see this being something where, and people are asking now, Teslas have pedestrian warning systems. Do you see this move towards EVs allowing us to hopefully make the road safer for our children in the future?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's why I say the fact that there's onboard computers, there's sensory input coming from all different angles. I don't know the science behind it, but I do believe that we have some very smart people that could figure it out, that if a child is like a certain height or there's something happening at that level, that we need to pay attention to it. I don't know if you saw the recent Tesla video about crashing into a pylon. I do know that there's great advances in terms of your self-driving vehicles, but to actually have that kind of sensitivity, maybe to see an object that's smaller but not a static object, but maybe one that moves, that could be a child or even an animal for that matter.
Fantastic. Well, Teri, from my side, I think I've gone through all the questions that I've been sent through from our audience. George, anything else from your side before we let Teri go?
No, Teri, really great initiative, and we need people like you in South Africa to keep our children safe. As we all probably agree, is that the children are the future of any nation, and the more of them, the more people we can keep alive, but the more children we can keep safe, the better for our future. So thank you for your work.
Yeah, we don't know who's the next Einstein, so let's allow them the opportunity to be there. Thank you very much, everybody.